I'm Shawn Collins of the Collins Law Firm. I want to talk to you about vapor intrusion. Now, if you're watching this video, you're concerned about vapor intrusion because someone perhaps has told you that your home is threatened with it, that maybe your neighbors' homes are threatened with vapor intrusion and you're concerned it might affect your home as well. I want you to understand how vapor intrusion occurs, how it comes to threaten a home. Basically, what we're talking about is chemicals dumped years ago, which now threaten the breathing space inside of a home. What you'll see in a minute is a poster that I've drawn to describe a very typical, not the only, but a typical vapor intrusion scenario. You'll see that I talk with this poster board, I talk about chemicals dumped at a factory years ago and how they come to threaten a home. But it doesn't have to be a factory. It can be chemicals dumped at a dry cleaner, for example. It can be a leaking underground storage tank at a gas station, for example. Lots of different ways that volatile chemicals, which turn into vapor form, can threaten the inside of a home, the breathing space in the inside of a home, and the health of the residents inside of it. So now we'll look at that sketch that I've drawn, and hopefully it will make clearer to you how it is that vapor intrusion occurs. I want to use what I've drawn on this poster board to describe a typical vapor intrusion scenario. So let me tell you what I've drawn here. Here's a factory, here's a home. Just one home, it's usually a neighborhood, but just one home. What you see here is the basement, and that'll become important in a minute. This right here, this line, is the surface of the ground. Everything on this side is underground. The squiggly line is the groundwater. That'll become very important in our discussion in a minute too. Now let's talk about the basic elements of how vapor intrusion occurs. It starts at the factory with chemical dumping, usually decades ago. Now there are a lot of different ways the dumping can occur. One of them is, for example, dump it right out the back door. Just take buckets of chemicals, throw it out the back door. Sometimes companies would put their chemicals in drums and bury the drums in the ground on the plant property. A variety of different ways to dump the chemicals, but usually years ago, as many as 50, 60 years ago, they would dump the chemicals on the ground on the factory property. That's number one. Number two is what kind of chemicals. And the chemicals that are important here to vapor intrusion are what are called volatile chemicals. And volatile is the important word because that means these chemicals that were dumped turn into gas over time. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The third most important piece of vapor intrusion, most important element, is that the chemicals, after they're dumped on the ground or buried in the ground, are not cleaned up. They're left to sit. Fourth, this soil right in between the ground surface and the groundwater is porous. In other words, the chemicals, once dumped and left there over time, they seep down through the soil and make their way to the groundwater. You need soil that's porous in order for that to happen, and it can take years, but porous soil will allow these chemicals dumped to get to the groundwater. The next element, the fifth element of vapor intrusion, is shallow groundwater. Now, here we have to talk about the difference between the groundwater that is contaminated with these chemicals and the floor of the basement of this home. That's the key distance. We're talking about this distance right here. Now, in vapor intrusion scenarios, there isn't much space between the contaminated groundwater and the basement floor. Sometimes, in some of the cases I've been involved in, this space here is as little as 5 to 10 feet. Sometimes it can be 30, 40, 50 feet. But the shallower the groundwater here is, the groundwater which is going to become contaminated with these chemicals, the more likely a vapor intrusion problem becomes. Element number 6 is the flow direction of this groundwater. You can think of this groundwater as an underground river in the sense that it flows, and it'll flow in a certain direction. When you have vapor intrusion that threatens this home here, and the people who breathe the air inside of it, what you find is that the contaminated groundwater, contaminated with these chemicals dumped years ago, flows in a certain direction. In other words, right toward where the homes are. That's how the chemicals get carried to a spot beneath the home. So the groundwater flows in that direction, right toward these homes, toward this. You can picture it as a neighborhood. Typically it is a neighborhood. And then the chemicals wind up in the groundwater underneath this home and in the vicinity of this home. And then these chemicals turn into a gas, they vaporize, and they start to migrate back up toward that home. Okay, so element number 6 is the groundwater must flow from where the chemicals were dumped toward the home. The next element is the home must be nearby. Now, typically homes that are threatened by vapor intrusion from chemicals dumped, say, at a factory, that home will usually be a couple of hundred feet away. I've seen that home be which is threatened by vapor intrusion be as far away as a half mile, usually not further. Typically fairly close to where the chemicals were first dumped. Also, another element you see typically in vapor intrusion is that this home not only is nearby, but it's usually an older home. In fact, sometimes with older homes you see they don't have a concrete basement. They may just have a dirt basement. And obviously, as you can imagine, if there's just a dirt basement, essentially a dirt floor to the home, much easier for chemical vapors to penetrate into the breathing space of the home. But even concrete is porous. It doesn't look porous, but in fact up close it is. And the vaporized chemicals can seep in through even a concrete floor that doesn't look like it has any cracks in it. But then of course if it's an older floor, it will have cracks because it settles over time, and with weather changes there will be cracks in the floor. There may be a sump pump, which is essentially a big opening in the basement floor. All kinds of ways for this chemical, now in a gas form, in a volatile or vapor form, to make its way into that home. Another thing that needs to be considered, and this is a 9th very important element of vapor intrusion, is that some people assume that it's this basement floor, which is the only level of the home that is threatened by vapor intrusion. Is that true? It is not. There are a variety of ways where chemicals which penetrate into the breathing air of the home can make their way onto this floor and even the highest floor of the home. And that's particularly dangerous because oftentimes this is where the bedrooms are, this highest floor here. Now, how do they make their way up there? Well, you can see this stairway I've drawn in here. Sometimes stairways provide a pathway for the chemicals to go up. Sometimes the HVAC system literally pumps the chemical vapors up through from the basement to the 2nd floor and even up to the 3rd floor, if there is a 3rd floor. This is why whenever I talk about the need to test a home for vapor intrusion, you not only need to test the basement, which is the closest to the contamination and therefore the most obvious one to test, but you need to test the other floors as well. 1, because chemicals can get there, and 2, because that's where most of the living in most homes is done. All right, so what you see here in this scenario I've described is how chemicals, certain kinds of chemicals, volatile chemicals, dumped or buried at this factory years ago, over time, and time is a key element, generally we're talking about decades, over time bleed down through the soil and make their way into the groundwater, the underground river, so to speak, which carries the chemicals in whatever direction that groundwater flows. And if it flows towards homes and flows underneath these homes, then you have the perfect storm, so to speak. You have the real threat of vapor intrusion. When you add to that scenario I've just described, an older home that's perhaps not that well constructed or that has cracks in the basement floor and therefore is not sealed against chemicals coming in, then you have the scenario where chemicals can get into the home. And I would add, I want to emphasize again, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is a particularly concerning scenario if the groundwater is not far away from the bottommost floor of the basement. As I say, in the cases that I've been involved in where vapor intrusion was the greatest threat to these homes, this contaminated groundwater was sometimes as shallow as 5 feet below the basement floor. And what that means is the chemicals didn't have very far to travel. So what I've described here is a typical scenario, not the only scenario, but a typical scenario where chemicals dumped years ago can threaten to enter the breathing space of an older home not far away from where the chemicals were originally dumped. That's called vapor intrusion.